A billionaire wandered aimlessly through the streets, immersed in thought after discovering he had a terminal illness. The items in his hands started slipping to the ground, but before he could react, a quick-witted poor boy stepped in to help. As a token of gratitude, the billionaire invited the boy to dinner, only to uncover a shocking truth: the boy was his only son, a son he had never even known existed. And now, as time slowly runs out, the only thing he desires is to make up for the hardships his son had endured in the past. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond the desolate stretch of cracked pavement. Dim streetlights flickered intermittently, casting weak amber glows onto the wet asphalt, their light barely reaching the narrow alleyways between old, graffiti-tagged buildings. The air smelled of damp concrete and faint traces of gasoline, the kind of scent that lingered long after the day had emptied the streets of life. David Sterling walked alone, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement, a stark contrast to the run-down neighborhood surrounding him. He held a brown paper grocery bag in the crook of his arm, its weight barely registering against the thoughts pressing down on him. His other hand clutched his phone to his ear, his grip tightening as the voice on the line delivered the words that made the night feel even colder. "The results are in, Mr. Sterling. It's advanced heart failure. End stage." The words cut through him like a blade, sharp and undeniable. For a moment he forgot to breathe. His chest tightened, but not from his failing heart, from something deeper, heavier. The world around him dulled. The neon signs in the distance, the occasional rustling of a stray cat knocking over a garbage bin, the sound of his own footsteps had all blurred into the background as reality anchored him in place. End stage. David barely noticed when his legs gave out beneath him. He sank onto the cold metal bench near a bus stop, the street lamp above him casting a faint halo over his hunched form. His mind raced, but there was nowhere to run from the truth. For years he was an untouchable billionaire, powerful. His money could buy anything except more time. He exhaled slowly, pressing his palm against his forehead, his fingers trembling just slightly. No, he had faced worse, hadn't he? He wasn't the type to break down. With a sharp breath, he forced himself to move. Pushing off the bench, he stood, straightening his spine, trying to summon the man he had always been the one in control. But as he adjusted his grip on the grocery bag, the damp paper suddenly gave way. The contents tumbled to the ground. Apples rolled across the uneven pavement. A carton of milk hit the curb and cracked open, leaking a thin, white stream onto the asphalt. A loaf of bread landed with a soft thud near a drain, teetering on the edge. David sighed through clenched teeth. He bent down, reaching for the closest apple, when another hand got there first. Before David could react, a small pair of hands darted forward. A boy, barely in his teens, hurriedly picked up the scattered items. White skin with lots of dirt, dressed in threadbare clothes 2 sizes too big, sneakers taped together at the soles. Yet his movements were precise, careful, making sure nothing else was damaged. "Here, mister," the boy said, holding up the bruised apples. His voice was light, but there was a steadiness in it, a quiet dignity. David studied him. Yet his movements were precise, careful, making sure nothing else was damaged. "Here, mister," the boy said, holding up the bruised apples. His voice was light, but there was a steadiness in it, a quiet dignity. David studied him. Beneath the dirt smudged on his cheeks, his deep brown eyes gleamed with something rare. "Thank you," David said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a crisp $20 bill and held it out. The boy's expression hardened. He stepped back, shaking his head. "I don't need that," he said simply. David's fingers curled around the bill, intrigued. Any other street kid would have snatched it without a second thought. "What's your name?" "Ethan." "Well, Ethan, do you always refuse free money?" Ethan shrugged. "It's not free if I didn't earn it." David chuckled, the sound foreign even to himself. This boy was different. Before he could say more, Ethan turned and walked off, his hands shoved into his oversized hoodie. David hesitated for a moment, then followed. Ethan wove through the streets with ease, his steps light, as if he belonged to the city itself. David kept his distance, watching, testing. A homeless man sat slumped against a brick wall, his outstretched hand trembling from the cold. Without pause, Ethan dug into his hoodie's pocket and pulled out a half-eaten granola bar. He crouched down, handed it over. The man muttered something gratitude, perhaps, and Ethan merely nodded before continuing on. Minutes later, an elderly woman struggled to carry her groceries up a set of stairs. Ethan wordlessly took 2 of her bags, carrying them to her doorstep. She fumbled in her purse, pulling out a couple of crumpled bills. Ethan smiled. "Nah, Mom. You have a nice day, though." David narrowed his eyes. Not once had the boy taken a reward. Then came the test that would show his true nature. The rain had started light, drizzling. Ethan ducked beneath the overhang of a small convenience store. The shopkeeper, a heavy-set man with a thinning comb-over, spotted him instantly. His expression twisted in disgust. "Get lost, kid," he snapped, stepping outside and waving a hand as if shooing away a stray animal. Ethan stiffened. David watched, waiting for a reaction. The shopkeeper sneered. "You're scaring off customers. People see your kind loitering, they'll think we got a problem." There it was. The shift in tone. The unspoken "you're kind." David felt a slow, burning anger rise in his chest, but he held back, watching Ethan instead. The boy's hands curled into fists at his sides. For a brief second, something dark flickered in his eyes. But he didn't argue, didn't spit back the same venom thrown at him. Instead, he swallowed hard, dipped his head, and stepped back into the rain. David took a step forward. "You," he said, his voice smooth yet cold. The shopkeeper turned, his frown deepening as he took in David's sharp suit, his air of quiet authority. "I don't know what business you got here, mister, but I ain't looking for trouble." David reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He placed it deliberately on the counter. "I don't want your products," David said. His tone was light, almost casual. "I just wanted to see how much your dignity costs." The shopkeeper's face turned red. David didn't wait for a reply. He turned, stepping out into the rain, and caught up to Ethan, who was already halfway down the block. "How about dinner?" David asked. Ethan eyed him suspiciously. "You just cussed out that guy back there. Now you want to feed me." David smirked. "I'd call that a fair trade." Ethan hesitated. Then, for the first time that day, he grinned. "All right," he said, "but I picked the place." And just like that, the rain didn't seem as cold anymore. David met his gaze. "I want to know you." Ethan froze, his fingers tightening around the straw for a fraction of a second before he forced out a scoff. "Yeah, okay. Rich guy sees a poor kid and suddenly wants to play dad. Real original." David's expression remained unreadable. "Did I say anything about playing dad?" Ethan blinked. The response threw him off, and for the first time since they sat down, he looked unsure. The waitress returned, dropping their food onto the table with a careless thud before walking off again. Ethan immediately grabbed a fry and shoved it into his mouth, chewing as he avoided David's gaze. David picked up his burger, examining it like some foreign object before taking a bite. The taste wasn't remarkable, but it was warm, real. He swallowed, watching as Ethan tore through his meal with the efficiency of someone who didn't know when his next meal might be. "You live with someone?" David asked. Ethan wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Yeah, my foster mom, Martha. She's all right." David nodded. "She take good care of you." Ethan hesitated before shrugging. "She tries." His voice was quieter now. David didn't push. He simply nodded, taking another bite. "And your real parents?" Ethan's chewing slowed. He set down his burger, fingers twitching slightly before he stuffed his hands into the front pocket of his hoodie. "Mom died 5 years ago. Cancer." David felt a strange weight settle in his chest. "I'm sorry." Ethan shrugged again, but this time it wasn't defiant, it was heavy. "It is what it is." "And your dad?" Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Never met him. Mom left me this, though." He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small, worn pendant on a thin chain. Said it was his. David's breath caught in his throat. The pendant was unmistakable simple, silver, with an engraving on the back, a gift he had given to a woman a lifetime ago. A woman he had once loved. A woman named Rebecca. His heart pounded as he stared at the pendant, then back at Ethan's face. And suddenly it was so clear, the shape of his nose, the sharpness of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. Oh God! Ethan wasn't just some kid. He was his son. David's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, his pulse hammering in his ears. The pendant swung slightly as Ethan held it up, the dim diner lights reflecting off the worn silver. It was the same. The exact one. He remembered the day he had given it to Rebecca, the way she had traced the engraving with her fingertips, smiling softly as if committing the moment to memory. And now, here it was, hanging from the neck of a boy who looked too much like his younger self for it to be a coincidence. His son. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Ethan, oblivious to the storm raging in David's mind, tucked the pendant back into his hoodie and reached for his shake, taking a long sip through the straw. He seemed unaffected, but there was something in the way his shoulders tensed that told David this wasn't just another casual conversation to him. David swallowed hard, forcing his expression to remain composed. His mind screamed to say something, to acknowledge the impossible truth, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he leaned back slightly, watching Ethan carefully. "Did your mom ever tell you anything about him?" His voice was steady but barely. Ethan let out a short, humorless chuckle, his grip tightening around his cup. "Not much. Just that he left before I was born, that he probably didn't even know I existed." He shrugged. But the movement was stiff, forced. "Doesn't really matter, though. She said he wasn't worth looking for." David's chest tightened, a deep, crushing guilt wrapping around his ribs. Rebecca had never told him. He had never known. And yet, here was his son, sitting across from him, completely unaware that the man who had abandoned him was right in front of him. Ethan looked up then, meeting David's gaze, and for a moment it was like staring into a mirror of his past. The sharpness in his features, the guarded look in his eyes, it was all too familiar. Something inside David cracked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "And if you had the chance to meet him?" Ethan snorted, shaking his head. "I wouldn't." David felt the words like a punch to the gut. Ethan pushed his plate away, appetite suddenly gone. "I mean, what's the point? He wasn't there when my mom was dying. He wasn't there when I needed him. A guy like that," he scoffed. "He doesn't get to walk back in like nothing happened." David's hands curled into fists under the table. He had never regretted anything in his life as much as he did in that moment. He wanted to tell Ethan the truth, to tell him that he hadn't abandoned him, that he had never even known he existed. But would that even matter? Would it change anything? David took a slow breath, steadying himself. He couldn't tell him. Not yet. Instead, he forced his voice into something neutral. "Seems like you've already made up your mind about him." Ethan shrugged again, but this time it was more defensive than indifferent. "Yeah, well, some people don't deserve second chances." David felt his throat tighten. The rest of the meal passed in silence. Ethan barely touched his food, and David couldn't bring himself to eat. When they finally left the diner, the night air was crisp, the city buzzing around them. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing at David as if unsure what to say. David looked down at him, 1,000 thoughts racing through his mind. He had spent his whole life making decisions based on logic, on strategy, but none of that prepared him for this. His son was right in front of him, and he had no idea. David exhaled slowly. "Let me walk you home." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "All right." And so they walked, side by side, the truth hanging between them like an unspoken confession, heavy and inevitable. David stood in front of the small, weathered house, the cold biting through his coat. It wasn't the kind of place he had ever imagined setting foot in. The porch light flickered, barely illuminating the peeling paint on the door. He hesitated, his fingers tightening into a fist before he knocked. A few seconds passed before it creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s. She was tall, sturdy, her dark skin lined with the weight of years and struggle, but her eyes were sharp, assessing him with a wariness that told him she had seen his kind before, rich men who thought money could fix things that were never about money to begin with. "You must be Martha Carter," David said, keeping his voice even. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you must be the man who should have been here 13 years ago." The words hit him harder than he expected. He swallowed, straightening. I didn't know. Martha exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. Rebecca never told you. And when she found out she was pregnant, it was too late. Your family had already torn her away from you. David's jaw tightened. A familiar rage burned in his chest, the same fury he had felt when he first realized Ethan was his son, when he understood the years that had been stolen from him. They forced her to leave. His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerous. Martha's eyes didn't waver. They didn't have to force her. Just made sure she had no choice. She loved you, but she wasn't going to beg. David's fingers curled at his sides. The weight of what he had lost, of what Rebecca had gone through alone, pressed against his ribs. And Ethan. Martha's gaze softened, just slightly. She raised him best she could, but when she got sick, there was nothing left. No savings, no family. She made me promise I'd take care of him. David's chest ached. You kept that promise. Martha studied him, her arms crossing. I did. And I don't regret it. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Finally, David inhaled deeply. I want to help. Martha let out a quiet scoff. Help? And what does that look like to a man like you? A check? A trust fund? Maybe a nice apartment far away from this neighborhood? David shook his head. None of that. I just want to do something. Anything. Martha tilted her head, considering him. Then, after a long moment, she stepped aside. You want to help? Then start by listening. David stepped inside. David stood in front of the small, weathered house, the cold biting through his coat. It wasn't the kind of place he had ever imagined setting foot in. The porch light flickered, barely illuminating the peeling paint on the door. He hesitated, his fingers tightening into a fist before he knocked. A few seconds passed before it creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s. She was tall, sturdy, her dark skin lined with the weight of years and struggle, but her eyes were sharp, assessing him with a wariness that told him she had seen his kind before, rich men who thought money could fix things that were never about money to begin with. You must be Martha Carter, David said, keeping his voice even. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. And you must be the man who should have been here 13 years ago. The words hit him harder than he expected. He swallowed, straightening. I didn't know. Martha exhaled, leaning against the doorframe. Rebecca never told you. And when she found out she was pregnant, it was too late. Your family had already torn her away from you. David's jaw tightened. A familiar rage burned in his chest, the same fury he had felt when he first realized Ethan was his son, when he understood the years that had been stolen from him. They forced her to leave. His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerous. Martha's eyes didn't waver. They didn't have to force her, just made sure she had no choice. She loved you, but she wasn't going to beg. David's fingers curled at his sides. The weight of what he had lost, of what Rebecca had gone through alone, pressed against his ribs. And Ethan. Martha's gaze softened, just slightly. She raised him best she could, but when she got sick, there was nothing left. No savings, no family. She made me promise I'd take care of him. David's chest ached. You kept that promise. Martha studied him, her arms crossing. I did, and I don't regret it. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Finally, David inhaled deeply. I want to help. Martha let out a quiet scoff. Help? And what does that look like to a man like you? A check? A trust fund? Maybe a nice apartment far away from this neighborhood? David shook his head. None of that. I just want to do something. Anything. Martha tilted her head, considering him. Then, after a long moment, she stepped aside. You want to help? Then start by listening. David stepped inside. Over the next few weeks, David did what he had never done before. He watched. He learned. He saw the life Ethan lived, the weight Martha carried, the quiet sacrifices made in a home that had barely enough to give but never let anyone feel like they had less. He didn't make grand gestures, didn't throw money at the problem. Instead, he made sure Martha got a better job, one with benefits, security, something that would let her breathe a little easier. He paid for medical bills, anonymously, so she wouldn't feel like it was charity. He made sure every child in that house had a future waiting for them. And Ethan noticed. At first, the boy was suspicious. He wasn't stupid. He saw the way things were changing. The groceries that lasted longer, the stress that eased off Martha's face, the sudden opportunity for her son, Deshaun, to finally get the surgery he had needed for years. Ethan wasn't sure what to do with it, with the quiet way things were shifting. But then Martha sat him down one night, her voice calm but firm. "Boy, I know you're stubborn," she said, watching him from across the worn kitchen table. "And I know you're angry. But you listen to me when I tell you this man ain't the villain you want him to be." Ethan scoffed, looking away. He left. He didn't know. He should have. Martha sighed, reaching across to place a hand on his. And now that he does, he's trying. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, wanted to hold on to the bitterness that had been his shield for so long. But he couldn't ignore the truth the way David hadn't forced his way in, hadn't demanded anything, hadn't even asked for a second chance. He had simply been there. So when Martha suggested he go see David, Ethan didn't fight her. He just stuffed his hands in his hoodie and muttered, "Fine." But as he stepped out into the cold night, making his way to where David was staying, his chest felt tight. He wasn't sure if he was ready, wasn't sure if he'd ever be, but for the first time he was willing to try. Ethan stood outside the towering penthouse building, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. The address Martha had given him felt out of place for someone like him. Marble floors, doormen in pressed suits, and an air of silence that made his skin itch. He hesitated, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pockets before finally exhaling sharply and pressing the buzzer. Moments later, the door swung open. David stood there, his usually composed face flickering with surprise. "Ethan," he said, almost disbelieving. You gonna let me in or what?" Ethan muttered, avoiding his gaze. David blinked, then stepped aside, gesturing him in. Ethan walked in cautiously, eyes darting over the pristine furniture, the gleaming city skyline visible through the massive windows. It felt more like a museum than a home. David barely had time to speak before a sudden sharp gasp left his lips. His body tensed, his hand flying to his chest as his knees buckled. "David?" Ethan's stomach lurched as he watched the man stagger. Instinct took over. He darted forward, catching David before he could collapse. "Hey, stay with me, hey!" David clutched at Ethan's sleeve, his breath ragged, pain etched across his face. Ethan turned toward the hallway, yelling, "Somebody call an ambulance." A moment later, hurried footsteps echoed through the penthouse as a housekeeper rushed in, her face pale with panic. Ethan tightened his grip, his heart hammering. "Hold on, old man," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't come all this way just for you to drop dead on me." The morning light streamed through the hospital blinds, casting soft lines across the sterile white sheets. David stirred, his body still weak but lighter than it had been in years. His illness had drained him, but something else, something unfamiliar, had begun to fill the hollow spaces. Across the room, slouched in the chair near the window, Ethan was asleep, arms crossed, hoodie pulled up to shield his face from the world. The boy had been there for days now, never saying much, never making any grand gestures, but he was there. And for David, that was everything. His throat was dry and he reached out, hand trembling slightly as he tried to grasp the cup of water on the bedside table. Before his fingers could curl around it, another hand got there first. Ethan, still groggy, pushed the cup toward him with an exasperated sigh. "You really can't do anything by yourself, can you?" His voice was rough with sleep, but there was no real bite in it. David smirked weakly, taking the cup. "I suppose I've been spoiled." Ethan snorted, leaning back. "No kidding. What kind of billionaire doesn't even know how to pour a drink?" David chuckled, and for the first time in a long while, it felt natural. "Maybe I need a teacher." He eyed the boy playfully. "Think you're up for the job?" Ethan pretended to consider. "Depends. How much does it pay?" For a brief moment their laughter filled the room, light and unforced. It was strange how easily they fell into this rhythm, mocking, teasing, a dance neither had realized they knew the steps to. And just like that, the weight between them began to shift, almost imperceptibly, but real. Over the next few days, Ethan stayed. He didn't say he was staying, Didn't make some dramatic declaration, he just kept showing up, kept lingering. One afternoon he arrived carrying something clunky in his backpack. With a smirk he plopped an old gaming console onto the hospital tray table and handed David a controller. "Ever played before?" David raised an eyebrow at the tangled mess of wires. "You mean to tell me people willingly spend hours staring at this?" Ethan scoffed, flipping on the screen. "You're about to find out." At first David was terrible. His fingers fumbled over the buttons, his character stumbling off cliffs, missing easy shots. Ethan, barely containing his laughter, tried to explain. "Dude, this is like the easiest game ever." David shot him a mock glare. "I am aware, thank you." Ethan wiped at his eyes, grinning. "Rich guy learns video games. This is going in the history books." David shook his head, exasperated but smiling. "You enjoy watching me fail, don't you?" Ethan smirked. "A little." They played until the nurses made Ethan leave, their laughter still echoing in the sterile halls long after. When David was finally discharged, Ethan surprised him by showing up at his temporary home, a sleek penthouse that looked far too big for just one person. But before David could comment on his unexpected visit, Ethan threw a bag of groceries onto the counter. "You're cooking," Ethan announced. David blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan was already rolling up his sleeves. "You lived 40 years without making a meal. That ends today." David eyed the ingredients warily. "How hard can it be?" The first egg cracked, shell and all, into the bowl. Ethan groaned. "Oh my God." The second attempt ended with flour covering half the kitchen. The third nearly resulted in a grease fire. Ethan doubled over with laughter, barely managed to keep David from burning the pan. David, wiping flour from his sleeve, sighed dramatically. "Well, at least now I know what I'd be terrible at if I ever lost all my money." Ethan grinned, tossing him a spatula. "Then you better make sure you never go broke." Somehow, despite the disaster, they managed to make something edible. They ate together, and for the first time, David realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked meal. As the days stretched on, they kept finding new ways to challenge each other. One evening, Ethan dragged David outside to a rundown basketball court. "You ever play?" Ethan asked, spinning the ball on his fingertips. David gave him a look. "I went to Harvard." Ethan snorted. "Yeah, that doesn't mean anything." He tossed the ball. David caught it, took a shot, completely missed. The ball bounced off the rim, rolling into the grass. Ethan grinned. "Not bad, for someone with no coordination whatsoever." David pointed at him. "Give me 5 more shots." Ethan shrugged. "Take 10, it won't help." They played until the sky darkened, the cool night air filled with the sound of sneakers against pavement, of laughter and playful jabs. David, breathless but exhilarated, realized he hadn't felt this alive in years. Later that night, they sat on the penthouse balcony, looking out at the city lights. The sky above them was vast, stars scattered tattered diamonds. David exhaled, his voice quieter now. "I spent my whole life believing power and money were everything. That if I had enough of it, I'd never feel empty." Ethan was silent for a moment, then spoke just as softly. "And now?" David turned to him, eyes heavy with something unspoken. "Now, I wonder what it would have been like if I had known sooner." Ethan didn't look at him. "I used to think about that too." David hesitated. "And now?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the pendant hanging from his neck. The air between them was thick with things neither of them knew how to say. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I guess I don't hate you." It was said so casually, so carelessly, but it hit David harder than anything else. He smiled, just slightly. "That's a start." One morning, Ethan showed up with something in his hands. It was an old photo frame, the edges worn, the glass slightly scratched. Inside was a picture of a young woman, Rebecca. "She used to say if someone really regretted something, they deserved a second chance," Ethan murmured. David stared at the photo, his throat tightening. "Do I?" Ethan met his gaze, studying him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he shrugged. "I don't know," he smirked, tilting his head. "But you can try." David chuckled, shaking his head. It wasn't an answer, but somehow it was enough. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.